Thank you, Chair.
Scott, would you like to?
Yeah, thanks. So you'll have heard we put a couple of questions to the previous witnesses about problems that the UAE had experienced in border control and the legal system that allowed the AQ car network to use Dubai as a transfer point in the distribution network of illicit nuclear materials. How do we know that those issues have actually been addressed?
The issue of border control and the issue of nuclear infrastructure broadly, I think, are both important issues to be considered. The NTI rating has been cited on various occasions as an indicator of the capability in terms of the infrastructure to regulate in the UAE. It's important to note that the NTI index was done several years ago, that the UAE is on a track towards putting in place the regulatory infrastructure that would be required of a country that has operating nuclear power plants. And the reviews that have been done by the IAEA and their two different advisory services that they've had into the United Arab Emirates report quite positively on the progress that the UAE is making towards establishing that infrastructure. As you would appreciate, Senator, there is a lot of infrastructure, regulatory infrastructure, to be put in place when you come from a position of not having a nuclear energy industry and needing to have it. The comments that have been made by various from the agency and elsewhere is that the UAE have taken the strategy of choosing the highest standard of advice and of implementation, and therefore they've been welcoming quite early in their process these other review missions, peer reviews and the agency's input. So they're taking that very seriously. And I note that the NTI conclusions were saying there is a possibility you could have a gap, but they weren't saying there was, but the other analysis would suggest that they are building solidly towards solid regulatory infrastructure within the country. So that shows the attitude that the UAE is taking to this, and it ties back to some of the other important discussion that you were having earlier, which is to do with the region. Is that the UAE see that for them to have a nuclear energy program, they need to implement the highest standards. And that partly is a consequence of the region in which they live, and that they see that that is important. So there are many different lines where we see, and also with like-mindeds that we talk with quite a lot, the UAE is putting in place very solid practices, standards and behaviours, and a number of these reporting mechanisms and review mechanisms are reporting very substantial performance and continued improvement.
But we need to be 100% confident that that improvement will continue. And how on earth, in a region as volatile as the Middle East, with technology as unforgiving as nuclear energy, can we be assured that in 5 years' time that won't all just be a distant memory?
I certainly agree that we want to have a strong level of assurance.
How will we get that?
Well, I just want to say that, Senator, with respect, we will not be able to ever have 100% confidence. We can't have that on any arrangement with any country. So I'm not wanting to verbal you in your question, but I just want to set the bar down a little, is that 100% for all of time is a difficult bar. But nonetheless, I'm agreeing with you, it's an important issue.
It's an important issue because this committee is being asked to put our names to an agreement that will be read back to us in 5 years' time if material is being trafficked, or if some of the scenarios that the previous witnesses put to us, for example, a nuclear arms race in the Middle East triggered by Iran, then Saudi, which would necessarily implicate the UAE or strongly potentially implicate them. We're being asked to put our names to that on the basis of due diligence that you are doing. We're a parliamentary committee. You are the ones coming to the table telling us that this thing is going to be watertight and asking us to lower the bar because there's no certainty in these matters.
Senator, I think the proposal we have before you is actually lifting the bar. rather than lowering the bar. The proposal we have before us is a nuclear cooperation agreement that goes further in its restrictions than other agreements that we've had. The proposal we have before us talks about a prohibition of the key technological processes of enrichment and reprocessing within the UAE. It reflects in that regard the domestic policy of the UAE, which again they chose because of where they live and their regional context. They chose to forego the right for enrichment and reprocessing within the UAE. And so when I look forward to 5 years hence and what sort of scenarios could we have, some of the scenarios about weaponisation are very difficult scenarios to see happening in a context where a country does not and will not have access to a knowledge of the key technologies of enrichment and reprocessing. So that taken out of the question and having a number of nuclear power plants doesn't actually equip them to be able to break out and develop nuclear weapons. So that is one reason why I would be more optimistic about the future than maybe not. There's a second really important factor, if I could raise as well, and that is that the United Arab Emirates have surveyed energy future options. They've done substantial reports, and within their sovereign decision-making processes, they have come to the conclusion that nuclear energy is an economic and an attractive option. They have no uranium. They actually don't have the nuclear technology either. So the only way that they can pursue a nuclear energy future for generation of electricity is in partnership with other countries. And they know full well that if things were to deviate substantially, that those agreements that they would rely on for their energy security into the future would then be starting to act in areas of ceasing cooperation and even more serious matters. So it is strongly in the UAE's interest to perform well, because that is fundamental to their energy security plans. They are putting their future and their energy security into the hands of international partners. Committee, I would say that's a strong motivation for a country to behave well, because otherwise their model is completely vacuous. So there are a couple of reasons, Senator Ludlam, why I would have some confidence about this case, and in some ways it is lifting the bar and is higher than other agreements that we have.
If they choose the path of North Korea, for example, where the technology is built by partner countries and at some point they just step out and say, okay, we're no longer considering ourselves subject to these agreements, once the reactor infrastructure is in place, where does that then leave us? There's nothing stopping any country, whether it's within the bounds of the NPT or not, to acquire the technology as the North Koreans did, and then to say, thank you very much, it's been a pleasure, and then step outside those agreements and continue. What protects us against that sort of behaviour? If, just so I've got this correct, you're proposing if the UAE was to come to a certain point of capability, etc., then choose to step outside of the NPT and outside of their agreements with the IAEA? India, without being a signatory to the NPT, chose a similar course. We'll have Canada turn up, build the reactors for us. Thank you very much. Now we're weaponising this material. So where do we stand in the event that the UAE, and forgive me for putting a hypothetical to you, but it feels like that's our job, to investigate the consequences signing on to these sorts of agreements? Yeah. And you know my normal answer to hypotheticals, but I am sensitive to the situation where you're trying to tease this issue out. As soon as the UAE is found to be in breach of its agreements by the IAEA Board of Governors,
then that triggers a whole series of different actions. And certainly, as you see in our agreement, it triggers an action, for cessation, even termination, of the agreement. So further cooperation then would cease. And the other agreements that the UAE has entered into have similar arrangements in them, such that they would then have a termination of this cooperation. Now, your scenario is that they have a nuclear power plant that works. They still don't have enrichment or reprocessing technology, so they can't produce fuel for a nuclear weapon, and they don't have a domestic source of uranium. So if they're going to move towards a weaponisation scenario, they've still got some absolutely critical pieces that are missing. So they would need high levels of support from some other countries if that was to happen at all. I think that's outside of our agreement with the UAE. But you can see it's actually a difficult scenario for the UAE if that was ever to be considered. And let me make it very clear for the record, is that we have no suggestion whatsoever that this is the consideration of the UAE. I just need to be very clear, Chair, on this matter.
No, it's understood. I think it's our job to put these scenarios to you. Last time I met, and as you say, you were in the air, I commended to the witnesses the 2013 Human Rights Watch report on the UAE, which indicates that the human rights situation there has worsened as authorities are arbitrarily detaining civil society activists. They're holding them in secret detention, they're harassing and intimidating lawyers. This is not a country that's kind to whistleblowers or independent journalists. Do you agree at the outset that those civil society feedbacks and protections are actually important in a country like Australia or other democracies in constraining abuse of power, particularly where these sort of technologies are concerned?
On this issue, I might turn to my colleague who does the regional work, on the UAE and the Middle East. And Lynette, have you got any comment on the civil society?
I certainly agree with the proposition you put forward about the importance of robust civil institutions and mechanisms that are in place. I don't disagree with that at all. The linkage to this agreement which we're looking at today, and the confidence that we might have that whistleblowers would have the scope to bring forward their concerns. I think on the last occasion that the committee met, we were confident that the particular arrangements that the UAE has set up in regard to its nuclear energy ambitions provided adequate safeguards, in that there is an international committee, an advisory committee, which is providing oversight and whose findings are made public.
Okay, that answers a question that I didn't ask. What is going to happen if a whistleblower inside the UAE nuclear industry wants to come forward because of issues in there? They're not going to be afforded any form of protection whatsoever. So you've agreed with me that civil society organisations are important, but then you've jumped across to a committee that is not a civil society at all. That's something that the UAE government has established. So what do you say to a journalist who wants to report on safety concerns, for example, or security concerns within the nuclear industry in that country?
Well, I'd say that I think the two actually are linked, with due respect. I think the fact that the UAE has recognised it needs to set up an independent advisory board who's free to take forward scrutiny of the industry, and presumably as part of that listen to concerns which are brought forward, is part of the answer. And
they're detaining people, they're detaining whistleblowers and holding them in arbitrary and secret detention. I wouldn't want to be an anti-nuclear campaigner and do the sort of work that I do here in Australia in the UAE, because you could find yourself disappeared, and that's the country that we're proposing to sell fuel to.
I do think that they're slightly different issues. I accept that there are concerns around some who have expressed political opinions, but I don't think we're dealing with a system where unilaterally everybody who expresses any differences with the rulers of the UAE is locked up.
Yeah, I think nuclear technology is likely to become somewhat politicised in that country, or be politicised, a political issue. It's not simply a technology choice that's being made here. I think I've made my point. I'll come back later.
You asked the question then, so
yeah.
you're right.
I'm sorry, Senator, could you repeat that?
These are
Put
political.
that
These are
point as a
political
question
issues.
rather than a statement.
These are political issues. So civil society actors inside the UAE, whistleblowers, independent journalists, people who might take a different position from the government on implanting 4 large nuclear power plants in their neighbourhoods, will have nowhere to go. And that's very different to a government authorised oversight board, or however they've framed it.
Tell me if I'm verbling you here. I think the point Scott's making is that you answered, Lynette, that there are not every question that somebody might raise where they have a view different to that of the government in the UAE will get them into strife. Is nuclear energy and the politics around that an area which is sufficiently politicised such that it would get them into trouble? Is that a fair way of putting your question?
Right, that's reasonable. It's a good start.
I'll be honest, I don't know in detail the debate within the UAE about various energy regimes, including a nuclear energy regime. But on the face of it, I wouldn't see that there would be difficulties with that, because my sense at the moment is that it has not been politicised within UAE society.
Okay. Have you been to the UAE?
I'm sorry?
Have you been there?
Yes, I have.
Okay. How much time have you spent talking to civil society groups or anti-nuclear groups, if you can find any in that country, people who might have a disagreement?
Well, and as I said, I have not examined in great detail the internal debate in the UAE on this subject.
I think that would tend to describe in general the department's approach to this. To me, it looks as though we're just being asked to sign off, and fingers crossed that all will be well. I'll come back later if there's time, Chair.
Okay.
I think we need to weigh it against as well the overarching interest we have in drawing the UAE into these international norms and international
I think we
architecture.
should draw the UAE into
Yeah,
building solar plants out in the desert, quite
let's-
frankly.
Lynette, presumably